All right, greetings everybody. Welcome to part 2 of Canada in the post-war world. First off, I'm hoping that this presentation is a little less crooked. I noticed in my last one my camera had been slightly tilted. Actually, it wasn't my camera, it was my projector, but I think I got it now, so hopefully I'm not at a slight tilt here. So we finished off last lecture, which covered the period 1945 to 1968. Talking about America's involvement in Vietnam, and of course Prime Minister Lester Pearson at the time in 1965 had made some vocal statements against the Vietnam War at the University of Pennsylvania, I think it was, or Philadelphia, I believe, which is in Pennsylvania, and that created quite a backlash. So I think Lyndon Johnson was pretty upset with Lester B. Pearson. In 1968, Canadians would elect a new president, and I don't know if it's really necessarily a comparison, but there is a certain comparison, I guess, on one level, that you could almost make the connection that Canada electing Trudeau in 1968 was almost similar to Americans electing Kennedy in 1960. What I mean by that is that it was, both leaders were a pretty profound departure from what Americans had elected before. In the case of Trudeau, he was considerably younger than others at the time. He was relatively hip, for lack of a better term. He could communicate with young people. He was comfortable with himself. Certainly the baby boomers gravitated towards Pierre Trudeau because of his charisma. He was well educated, had all the sort of, the top quality leadership qualities, you know, that you've probably heard me say over and over and over again about what makes good leadership. And I think Trudeau is just one of those people who came in at the right time. And, you know, he represented sort of a new generation of Canadians who, you know, by the mid-late 60s were now voting as a bloc, really. These baby boomers, a huge demographic of young people who were all sort of in their early to mid-20s at this point. So the other thing is, you know, Trudeau, well, here are some pictures we can look at. Here he is, of course, with John Lennon and Yoko Ono, who spent some time, of course, in Montreal, in the hotel room, the bed in, I can't remember what it was called, but yeah, of course there's a lot of it floating around on YouTube of them lying in bed, you know, there's that great sequence when all these people are in the hotel room with him singing Give Peace a Chance, and pretty remarkable stuff that he chose to come to Canada to stage his protest, if you will, and Trudeau met with him. This is something that would come as a great, with great frustration from the Americans, of course, that Pierre Trudeau had developed a relatively warm and close relationship with Fidel Castro. Now, of course, this does not mean that Pierre Trudeau was a Marxist or a communist sympathizer. I think he was intrigued with the Cuban Revolution. I think he was a bit enamored with the mystique of Castro as a revolutionary. And there were probably many things about the Cuban government that the Canadian government may have identified with, socialized medicine being one. But in the same breath, there were probably many things about the Cuban government that Trudeau didn't care about or didn't favor. But the reality is that, you know, Cuba had been completely isolated by the Americans, and unfortunately that isolation led to a close relationship with the USSR. And for Trudeau, I think having a diplomatic relationship with Cuba was just a manifestation of Canada making its own decisions, even at the chagrin, if you will, of the Americans. So, 1968, Liberal leader Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, PT, Prime Minister, and charted a more independent foreign policy, evident when he recognized the Communist government of China in 1970, despite U.S. requests to withhold this recognition. The reason the Americans asked Trudeau to withhold his recognition is because they were beginning to think about and plan their own olive branch to China. And Richard Nixon had told Trudeau, look, we're planning on doing this. We don't want you to rain on our parade, so we'd appreciate if you held off until after we did it. And Trudeau said, well, why would I do that? I've already got the ball rolling. We're already in the process. I'm not just going to put it on pause because you guys want to do it before us. And, you know, we know, too, that the relationship between Richard Nixon and Pierre Trudeau became pretty tense, much like the Diefenbaker-John F. Kennedy rivalry. What's interesting about the Chinese delegation is that when the first Chinese delegation came to Canada to meet with Trudeau and leading officials in the Canadian government, the first thing they said when they got there was, "Excuse me, Mr. Prime Minister, could you please take us to the Norman Bethune Memorial?" And Trudeau had to tell them that we don't have a memorial for Norman Bethune. And if you recall from a previous lecture in the 1930s, Norman Bethune was a Canadian doctor who traveled to not only Spain during the Civil War, but he went to China during the Civil War, where he was instrumental in helping the communists through his field hospitals and through his mobile blood transfusion units. In fact, Norman Bethune would die of blood poisoning, interestingly enough, in China. So it's interesting that here come the Chinese delegation to pay homage to their great Canadian hero, who's like right up there with, maybe not quite as high as Mao Zedong, but he was pretty high up there. And the Canadian government's like, well, we don't have a memorial for Bethune. So anyway, so right off the bat, this creates quite a strong series of tensions, if you will, between the US and Canada. Trudeau recognized that China was a major player and they bought much Canadian wheat and other goods, so it only made sense that you bring them out from the cold. At that point, they probably had a population approaching 1 billion, if not somewhere between 800 million and 1 billion. And you can't just ignore the existence of a nation. It didn't make any sense at all. However, Trudeau had no wish to anger the US and held the practical view that Canada's close economic relationship was to be considered when policies implemented. So Trudeau didn't go into these diplomatic endeavors lightly. You know, he didn't become friendly with the Castro government and the Chinese government just to stick a pin in the eye of the Americans. This was strictly economic. This was about trade relationships. This was about demonstrating to other nations that they are respected, and while they've got a different system and a different way of life, that shouldn't hold us up from becoming economic and trading partners, I think is probably the best way to put it. He wanted to scale back Canada's participation in the nuclear arms race. This is Trudeau we're talking about. With the USSR, and from 1970 to 72, nuclear missiles were removed from Canada's NATO forces in Europe. Interesting. So there's quite a shift here. Bulwark missile sites that Pearson had allowed in 1963 were removed, and by 1984 the last nuclear warheads were removed from Canadian soil. So from 1984 onward, Canada did not have any nuclear missiles. So Canadian defense budgets were cut and NATO troops were cut in half, despite US disapproval. However, Canada did continue in NATO and NORAD. And this was, of course, another thing that infuriated Richard Nixon. And I'm sure, although I haven't officially heard or read recently, I'm sure we could go back to Nixon's Watergate tapes and find lots of anti-Trudeau commentary somewhere in there. But anyway, interesting stuff. All right, so Canada is a middle power. So despite the Cold War between the West, the Americans and their allies, and the East, the USSR and their allies, most of the world's people were detached from either superpower, especially countries in Africa and Asia recently decolonized after World War II. Most countries in the Southern Hemisphere were far less industrialized and most were very poor. So really, when it comes to economic questions of you know, poor countries in Africa, for example, they're not really that concerned about ideology, about capitalism or market economics or Marxism and Leninism, although certainly there were several African countries that moved in that direction. In most cases, African countries are just trying to find ways of developing their economies so that they can bring food and essentials to their people. And a lot of that is about learning how to do agriculture, learning how to do business with other nations, learning how to manage your own money and your banking system and all these things. Because when colonialism finally falls back, and all of a sudden these people in Africa and Asia who've been micromanaged by European powers for generations are suddenly left to their own devices. And in many cases there was very little left for them, which is quite tragic. So, they had to kind of figure it out on their own. So there tends to be a lot of chaos in Africa and Asia through much of the 60s and 70s as a result of sort of European powers packing up and leaving, if you will. Trudeau wanted to bridge the gaps in order to promote world peace and understanding amongst nations. Developed nations have a moral responsibility to help undeveloped nations through trade and aid. Okay, so for Trudeau, it is the moral responsibility of nations that are highly developed, are fairly fruitful, if you will, in wealth, that it is our moral obligation to help these nations. Not exploit them, not control them, but to actually help them. Send people down there, send Canadian advisors to teach them agriculture, to implement water supply systems, to everything. Not babysit them, not throw money at them, but to actually help and teach them ways in which they can become independent for themselves. In 1968, Trudeau created a new government body known as the Canadian International Development Agency to boost foreign aid to less developed nations. In return for aid, here's the catch, it wasn't strictly for free, countries would agree to buy products manufactured in Canada, a sort of win-win relationship. So we will help you develop your economy if you promise to buy our Canadian-made products. And I hate to use stereotypes, but you could say maple syrup. You could say, wheat bread. Who knows? I mean, I know it's silly, but you get the point. The point is that we help you and you help us by buying our surplus products that we're selling overseas anyway. This was known as Tide Aid. Okay, Tide Aid. We help you, you buy our stuff. Okay, that's the relationship. And Canadian aid to developing nations increased from $277 million in '69 to over $2 billion by 1984. So this Tide Aid system worked very, very well. In addition, Canada's membership in the Commonwealth and La Francophone enforced Canadian involvement, like the Colombo Plan, which provided money and aid to undeveloped countries through the Commonwealth. Okay? So what you're seeing on behalf of Canada is a sort of activism overseas, but not an activism to control economies, an activism to exploit resources. It is benevolent, which means it is intended with kindly intentions, but there's got to be something given back. So that was the benefit for Canada in helping these nations. All right. So you might recall in the last lecture we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the USA and the USSR this close to nuclear war. After that period, roughly 1963 to 79, there was a period known as détente. And in that 16-year window, there was strong attempts by both the Soviets and the Americans to somehow reduce tensions between the main superpowers. There were a variety of treaties that negotiated, the stopping of selling nuclear technology to allies. There were the SALT agreements of 1972 intended to actually reduce and limit the amount of nuclear weapons that are being developed, and so on and so forth. So a lot of things were moving in the right direction, but 1979 is a shift because the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, and that is kind of where we see a re-emerging anti-Soviet policy, and particularly in 1980 when Ronald Reagan is elected president. So despite a thaw, tensions increased again when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Both sides increased and improved nuclear technology. on Europe's soil. So unfortunately, Europe is kind of the guinea pig in between these two massive monolithic powers, and all the nations of Western and Eastern Europe are being armed to the teeth. If there was going to be a huge nuclear blowout, it may very well have happened in Europe. 1980, many Western nations boycotted the 1980 Olympics in Moscow in protest of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I remember this very, very clearly because, of course, the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc nations dominated that Olympics as a result because they didn't have the competition they should have had because of the boycott. In 1983, the Soviets would shoot down a Korean passenger jet which strayed into Soviet airspace, and the U.S. would invade the Caribbean nation of Grenada to depose a left-wing government. So the Korean passenger liner, the invasion of Grenada are examples of the length to which both the Soviets and the Americans were willing to go to protect their national security, or at least their perception of their national security. I mean, you could certainly be very critical of a Soviet shooting down a passenger liner of all things, or the Americans invading a tiny island in the Caribbean. But from the perspective of both the Soviets and the Americans, these were national security concerns. The Grenada situation being that it was a left-wing communist-influenced government, and the fear was that they'd have another Cuba on their hands, so they didn't want that. Latin America becomes a real hotspot, a Cold War hotspot, when the U.S. ousted a left-wing government in Chile in 1973, and through covert actions tried to destabilize a group known as the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, who came to power through revolution in 1979. It's interesting that in 1979, one of the leading figures of the Sandinista revolution was a fellow named Daniel Ortega, and he is currently, in 2020, the president of Nicaragua. This fellow up here is oh gosh, what's his name? Not Jacob Orbans. Salvador Allende is his name. He was the democratically elected Marxist leader in Chile. From 1970 to 73, a communist government was democratically elected by the people, and of course the Americans couldn't stand that. And the Americans and the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, got involved covertly to overthrow this socialist government, which they did. So, and from 1973 to 1989, I believe, if not even later, I can't remember the exact year, a pretty brutal dictatorship under the leadership of Augusto Pinochet, a right-wing dictatorship, came into power with support from the United States. And one of the tragedies of the Latin American situation in the 70s and 80s was that the Americans were really active in supporting anyone who was anti-communist. And oftentimes these organizations that they support tend to be very, very ruthless and almost sort of pseudo-fascistic in characteristic. They're military regimes, they have ruthless policies, they eliminate political enemies or those deemed political enemies. Pretty ugly stuff that occurs in Honduras and Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and places like that. So really, a lot of legitimate reformist governments in that region become victims of the Cold War mentality and end up being overthrown by CIA operatives and military coup d'etats. So it's a very, very tricky situation. U.S. President Reagan, who comes in power in 1980, fired up the anti-Soviet rhetoric and tension increased again. Now, what's interesting about the Reagan period is that I was 13 years old when Reagan became president, and I was just beginning to sort of pay attention to politics a little bit. And I remember watching his inauguration speech, which would have been January 1981. And I remember thinking, God, this guy looks like he's stepped off of a movie set from the 1940s. He had that sort of, that demeanor, that swagger of a 1940s actor, and he was a bit of an anachronism in that he did sort of project that image. And I think that was part of his appeal, that he did have a history of acting, of course. And I think that people remembered him from the 40s and 50s. He was kind of comfortable, he was safe, he was charming. Certainly he was, he had that sort of Hollywood sort of manner about him. And, you know, he turned out, in hindsight, to be quite a remarkable president, although at the time I was very critical as a young man of his policies in Latin America. But he really fires up the language. You know, he refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, I remember. You know, so a lot of anti-communist language is cropping up in news media in the 1980s. By 1984, Trudeau grew tired of politics, and by 84 he'd officially retired. And you know, what a career. 16 years he was leader, I think, except for a short period in 1980, where Joe Clark was Prime Minister. You know, for the vast majority of that 16 years, he was the Prime Minister. So he had a huge impact on Canadian politics. All right, September 84, Conservative leader Brian Mulroney took power and tried to forge closer links with the U.S., developing a close relationship with U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Here they are, Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan. When they met, of course, they became fast friends. I believe I've seen a clip of them at some sort of social gathering, probably a White House party of some kind. I think they're singing "When Irish Eyes Are Smiling." I'd have to look again. But anyway, there was no question that their affection for each other was pretty clear. They were both pretty charismatic, pretty bright, capable leaders, and I think they just kind of connected. So in many ways it was good, because I think the American-Canadian relationship had been a little bit kind of rocky for quite some time. So in 1985, the U.S. unveiled a plan to create a satellite-based defensive shield known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, nicknamed Star Wars, right? But Canada did not participate, nor did the program come to fruition. So this was kind of a, fortunately, ahead of its time, and too ahead of its time, because the technology wasn't there to make this happen. Strategic Defense Initiative was the concept of implementing nuclear technology on satellites so that you could actually shoot nuclear missiles from space. You could shoot them at a target, or you could eliminate incoming nuclear weapons coming at your country from space. So, 1987, Mulroney removed tariffs on goods crossing the border with the Free Trade Agreement, which was established in 1989. Very contentious issue, and one that has just now been reevaluated recently by the Trump administration, called the USMCA, US, United States, M, Mexico, CA, Canada, which is a reworking of this Free Trade Agreement by the Trump administration. But so yeah, NAFTA it was called, yeah. 1992, the Mulroney government expanded the free trade zone with NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, which included now Mexico. And of course that was in effect for nearly 30 years. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien signed NAFTA, which came into effect in 1984. So, you know, quite a process from the beginning of the Free Trade Agreement in 1987 to its full effect in 1994, basically 7 years. Real simple and quick. Free trade is the idea of not having border taxes or tariffs on imports of goods. So in other words, if Canada wants to sell stuff to the United States, they can do it without tariffs or taxes. If the Americans want to sell stuff to Canadians, they can do it without border taxes. Oftentimes tariffs are implemented to protect local industries. Okay, so I'll use a metaphor I use all the time when I talk about free trade or protectionism or whatever it may be. Free trade is this, or let's look at the opposite of free trade, protectionism. Okay, protectionism is the idea that if you, for example, if the Americans are producing radios for 25 bucks a pop, and the Germans can import them to the States for 23, and they're the same radio, which ones are the Americans going to buy? They're going to buy the German one because it's the same radio for $2 cheaper. So what the Americans do is they put a $3 tax on every German radio, so when it hits the market it becomes 26 cents and the American one becomes 25, right? You're protecting American business, because now Americans will buy the American-made radio because it's only 25 cents to the 26 cents German one. Protectionism is not good for the consumer. This is the problem, because consumers end up paying more. If consumers could pay $23 for a radio because it came in through the US by free trade from Germany, people would buy the German radio. That's competition, right? That would force the American manufacturers to reduce their price so that Americans buy American. So that's free trade when there's no taxes. So the only problem with free trade, that the critics of free trade basically say that the big problem is that what that means is that huge American manufacturers who have 10 times the size of the economy to that of Canada can flood the Canadian markets with American-made stuff, whether it be stuff through Walmart or whatever it may be. Walmart's a good example, right? Because at the end of the day, yes, it's American-owned, yes, a lot of the profits are going back to the States, but at the end of the day, products are cheaper for Canadians. So what's more important, buying Canadian or buying cheaper products so you have more dispensable income for your family? It's a conundrum, right? But that's what free trade was all about, that goods could move easily between the countries. Canada's political and economic fortunes moved much closer to the US after NAFTA as well. So think of it like this way, our economies are now becoming embedded with each other. All right, and current events at the time, boy, there was such dramatic change. I'll never forget the events that rolled out that led to the end of the Cold War. And it starts really with this fellow coming into power in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. A new young leader emerged named Mikhail Gorbachev, who implemented sweeping economic, social, and political reforms to improve conditions, called perestroika, along with a new openness and freedom of speech, glasnost. Basically, Gorbachev wanted to heal the communist system. He wanted to loosen things up so that people didn't feel so constricted, that people stopped being afraid of speaking out about their feelings, about how they feel about stuff. He wanted to reform from within. But unfortunately, what Gorbachev does is, by allowing people constructive criticism, allowing people to open up a shop for the first time and make a profit for the first time in 7 years, it almost sort of kicked open this incredible suppressed anger and frustration in the Russian people, who for 7 years had to keep their mouth shut and just deal with what they got. So it was a huge shift at the time. All across Eastern Europe, nations shook off the cold, rigid systems in effect since World War II, and in Berlin on November 9th, 1989, the wall opened up, signaling the end of the Cold War. I miss this. I was in Germany in 1988, 1990, and 1991. When does the wall go down? In 88. When I was there in 88, I knew, you could tell there was something going on. There was so much drama already beginning to percolate in Eastern Europe. So, December 91, the USSR would also collapse, creating a series of new independent states. So the collapse of the Soviet Union creates a new Russia, but also all those republics who were once part of the Soviet Union but were not Russian people also become independent republics as well. You know, whether you're talking about Georgia or Armenia or Kazakhstan and many, many, many others. So the whole communist system completely collapses in the Soviet Union. So China also experimented with a kind of perestroika, but they did not tolerate political freedom. Of course, they clamped down on their protesters, and the communist system remains to this day. So, June 4, 1989, a student movement promoting political freedom was violently put down in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And despite this, the Cold War came to an end, and with the collapse of the USSR, despite Vietnam, Cuba, China, and North Korea holding on to their one-party communist systems. And here we are in, 2020 and beyond. Vietnam, Cuba, China, North Korea still maintain their relatively rigid communist systems, although the difference now is that Vietnam and China specifically have really opened up market reforms. You're allowed economic freedom in these countries, there's no political freedom. You can't criticize the government, but you can make as much money as you want if you have a skill that lets that happen. Cuba's kind of opening up a bit. North Korea is the isolated, holding on to those Stalinist strings, and they're not even really, I don't know what kind of system you call it now. They're very, very isolated, very rigid, very intolerant, very different place when you look at North Korea and Vietnam, for example. So, all right, the end of the Cold War saw the rise in regional and ethnic conflicts, most notably in the Persian Gulf, Africa, and former Yugoslavia. So here's the thing. Remember how we talked about in previous lectures that when colonialism collapsed, all those, the French, the British, the Belgians, the Germans, and everybody else basically cut and run from their colonies. In their wake, they've left chaos because, you know, these people have been controlled by the Europeans for so long, they didn't necessarily have the tools to figure out how to control themselves, and you end up with years and years of civil war and chaos. Well, what happens in the former Eastern Bloc is that all these old tensions that had been suppressed by a dictatorship suddenly come to the fore. So in Yugoslavia, for example, and boy, it's very complex, and I hate to kind of give a Coles Notes version of this, but at the end of the day, in the Balkans, what is known as the country of Yugoslavia, you have, it's multi-ethnic. You have Croatians, and Serbians, and Albanians, and Macedonians, and Montenegrins, and you name it. All kinds of people living within one country. And when that old communist system crumbles away, all those ethnic tensions come to the fore, and you end up with a really, really ugly civil war in Yugoslavia, largely instigated by the Serbian majority, and it's just a shame that after everything these countries have been through that you see this kind of ethnic tension. Chechnya as well in the former Soviet Republic, same kind of thing. So, August 1990, Iraq invades the oil-rich country of Kuwait, and the UN demanded their withdrawal. In January 91, the UN invaded and ousted Iraq from Kuwait within 3 days. Of course, when Iraq is evicted from Kuwait, the leader, Saddam Hussein, stays in power. And many believe that he should have been removed from power because, of course, later, in 2003, he would be accused of the one who was somehow tied in or responsible for 9/11, or that he had weapons of mass destruction in his borders, and that becomes the reason for the 2003 invasion some 12 years later. And of course that creates a whole series of events, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, you name it, after, so messy. Canada contributed a squadron of CF-18 fighter bombers, units of the Canadian Army, and ships patrolling the Persian Gulf. The U.S. led the attack along with 27 other member nations. And I'll never forget this war because I remember watching on CNN. You could actually, it was almost like you're looking through a telescope, and you could watch bombs flying and buildings exploding. It was very, very strange. Laser-guided bombs and cruise missiles launched from many kilometers from the target forever changed the nature of war. U.S. President declared a new world order with the UN taking a key role as global police. So once the Soviet Union collapses and the Cold War as we knew it is over, the U.S. is kind of like the lone superpower, and I think that they really were not necessarily interested in being the sole world's policeman anymore. So there was this sense that, okay, let's kind of pull back a bit. You know, the Truman Doctrine pulled us in every direction around the world. We need to focus on our own economy. And in many ways, the manifestation of Trump is that idea of sort of retreating and focusing on America first, right? America will be great again, as Trump would say. The UN would move beyond peacekeeping, negotiating settlements and keeping warring factions apart, to peacemaking, using force to punish aggression. So you see the UN in the post-Cold War period actively involved in Yugoslavia, in Africa, Somalia, and later Rwanda, in trying to settle really complex ethnic disputes amongst rival tribes and groups in these areas. Oh, there we are, Somalia and Rwanda. Okay, 1992, the UN launched Operation Restore Hope in Somalia, an East African country ravaged by civil war and starvation. Directed by the UN, Canada would contribute in distributing food and other essential supplies to the desperate population. A crisis in Canada's armed forces developed when a teenager was arrested wandering on the Canadian base and was tortured and killed by members of the Canadian Airborne Division. I'll never forget this too. This came as a great shock, deeply upsetting, considering Canada's reputation for many, many years as a humanitarian role. You know, you can never rationalize this kind of thing, and nor would I ever even try to be an apologist for it, but you know, the full circumstances are still a bit shady. I mean, in terms of why and how this happened. Was it alcohol? Was it drugs? Was it fear? Was it a combination of everything? Who knows? But the fact that it happened is, it happened. And, you know, you can't take that away, you know. So this poor kid, for whatever reason, was tortured by this airborne division. In Rwanda, another ethnic conflict resulted in a brutal conflict, and Canadian Major Romeo, I think it's Romeo Dallaire, here he is here, was sent by the UN to control the situation. Dallaire had an impossible situation. There was a very small contingent of the United Nations there, not enough to keep peace between the Hutus and the Tutsis, the two warring tribes. What ends up happening is a sort of a bloodletting of anger and frustration, where one group brutally murders another with the use of machetes, of all things, too. So it's a horrible situation. Realizing a serious lack of resources, he asked for massive UN and American troops to control the violence. The response was unresponsive, unenthusiastic, and Dallaire was left with a small group to helplessly witness the murder of over 1 million people killed in only a few weeks. It was a grotesque display of brutal civil war, bigotry, hatred, and violence, the likes of which we hadn't seen since the end of the Second World War on this scale. Or since the war itself, for that matter. So really quite a remarkable, horrible thing. There's a film that's quite good, although historians have a bit of a beef about some of the narrative. But it's, you know, that aside, I think it really builds on the tension that existed in Rwanda. It's called Hotel Rwanda, and the actor Nick Nolte plays the role of Romeo Dallaire, although I'm not even sure if he's actually referred to as Dallaire in the film. He's given a different name, but Hotel Rwanda, it's a good film. The UN was and continues to receive criticism from many people as a result of these failures. I mean, as a result of Somalia, as a result of Rwanda, and the Sudan later, you know, the UN has taken a beating in public opinion because of its inability to quell these situations, but in reality, nobody could have really effectively have dealt with. These are complex ethnic civil war rivalries that go back generations, and for the UN just to roll in and try to suppress it is pretty tough, especially when you've got such few numbers as you had in Rwanda. There's just no way that they could do it. All right, well, when the Soviet Union collapses in 1991 and things begin to shift and change, there's a recognition that all the world economies are open to be more connected, because it's no longer this bilateral communist and non-communist world. This is happening around the same time that the internet is beginning to really show its impact in society. Now, the internet doesn't really come in as a sort of everyone has it kind of thing until the early 21st century, but it is beginning to emerge as a way by which nations and peoples can communicate, whether it be through email, whether it be through websites. I mean, those of you that are young watching this lecture, maybe you're 18, graduating from high school or whatever, maybe you're close to it, you are of an age when, since you were born, you had access to computers and tablets and iPhones and everything else. That wasn't the case 30 years ago. I always joke with my students that, you know, I remember a time before the VCR. And then my students put up their hands and say, Mr. Tolman, what's a VCR? And I realized, oh my gosh, the VCRs were already gone by the time they were born, or close to it anyway. So you know, for them, it's a historical relic, a VCR. But you know, there's some real changes, a rapid new shift towards globalization. 93, the Liberals under Chrétien came into power with priorities to expand Canada's trading opportunities. He organized Team Canada to open trade missions in Asia and Latin America and joined APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Group, to promote freer trade amongst Pacific nations. So, and you know, a recognition that right on the other side of the Pacific is a huge market. Whether you're talking Japan or China or Singapore, the Philippines or Malaysia or Indonesia. Huge markets. A trend known as globalization developed. A vast network of businesses, communications, and cultural links amongst nations resulting from rapid changes in technology and the fall of communism. You know, right now, you know, I'm just finishing up my master's degree, and I'm doing it in on the other side of the country, in St. John's, Newfoundland. It's remarkable. Whenever I phone the university for a question, they've got this great thick accent. I love it. And here I am on the Pacific Coast. I couldn't get any further from St. John's, Newfoundland, but I'm very comfortably doing my master's degree online. And I could not be doing this without the internet. So I'm definitely a benefactor of this technology, for sure. The internet now made it possible to do business online in almost any part of the globe. Some see globalization as a form of economic and cultural imperialism. Okay. So here's the problem. It sounds good. Open markets, everybody can communicate, everybody can set up a web page and sell their products all over the world. Well, the companies that have the biggest industries and the biggest money are the ones that are going to benefit. So let me use a metaphor of Coca-Cola. Let's pretend half the world didn't know what a Coke was before the Soviet Union collapsed. And all of a sudden, the Americans can flood the world market of Coca-Cola around every corner of the globe. And along with that, you can have all kinds of fancy advertising. And before you know it, everybody in the four corners of the globe wants to drink Coca-Cola. Or they want to wear Nike tennis shoes, or they want to wear Major League Baseball hats, or wear sports jerseys, you know, which you see all over the world. Kids want American-made products. People want Levi's jeans, and so on and so forth. So you're not forcing anybody to want those things, but you are creating advertisement in such a way that you are creating demand by effective advertising. So some see, you know, globalization as a form of cultural imperialism, that you can enforce American culture on people around the world, but they have the choice, right, of whether they want to wear a pair of Nike shoes or drink a Coca-Cola. But it's amazing what globalization and advertisement can do. Some fear that open free trade has resulted in the loss of Canadian jobs because corporations will set up shop where wages and regulations are low. Now this, holy mackerel, is huge. And this is what happened in the mid-1990s during the Clinton administration in the United States, is that he opened up economic relations with China so that American manufacturers would have access to the Chinese market for selling surplus American-made goods. What Clinton didn't understand maybe or appreciate at the time was that all those American companies, Nike, Coca-Cola, whoever it might be, said, well, wait a second here, does this mean that I can go and set up shop in China and leave Seattle, Washington, and then make shoes in China? Because if I do, because the standard of living is so much lower, I can pay far less in wages, and as a result, Americans get cheaper running shoes because they're made in China, right? And so all of a sudden, the manufacturing industry, which had already been moving out of America, was now being shipped overseas. Mexico as well, right? Because these places don't have the same kind of labor regulations, and you can pay your employees peanuts in these regions. So from a profit point of view, it's great for Nike. From a consumer point of view, it's great for Americans because they get cheap stuff made in China. Where you have an issue is that American manufacturing disappears, right? And one of the great tragedies of say the Trump administration is that he's saying, we're going to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Everyone goes, hey, absolutely, American made. Well, are you going to have to pay American workers more than Chinese workers? You bet you will. So if you are going to have to pay American workers a reasonable wage, which they should be paid, don't get me wrong, what is that going to mean for Nike runners made in the States when it comes to their cost when they're on the market? They're going to be way more expensive than Chinese-made Nike runners. So that is the fundamental flaw with bringing back manufacturing to America. You got to find a way where it's not going to cost Americans an arm and a leg to buy things for 10 times as much as what they're used to. So it's really tricky. Is business good business when we invest in countries where human rights abuses? I mean, you've heard of sweatshops, you've heard the term sweatshops. Well, geez, if you can set up a running shoe company in Singapore, I'm not picking on Singapore, but let's pretend they had no labor regulations and you could exploit people. They got to work 12 hours a day, they get paid peanuts, and they're making runners which you're selling back to the American market for really, really cheap. Then the Americans are thrilled because they got cheap running shoes, and they may not even know that the people that are making them in Singapore are starving and are being brutalized by a tyrannical company that enforces punitive laws to enrich themselves and to make products cheap for Americans. So it's a tricky business, right? I mean, I would love the idea. I think now, and I don't know where things are going to go, but right now there is going to be a real push at the end of this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, where I think we're going to see what is called protectionism, that countries are going to say we have to produce stuff ourselves because we need jobs in our country, we need to be more self-sufficient, we need to be less reliant on other people, other countries for imports and exports and so forth. So I think there's going to be a real push towards that kind of thing coming up. But something to think about. Should we be made aware that the runners that we're wearing are $30 Nikes or $40 Nikes are made because people are being horribly exploited overseas? It's difficult. All right, so that being said, that is where we will stop. And yeah, that's where we're going to stop for Canada at the sort of the dawn of the 21st century rather. Next lecture is going to be looking at Canada at home, how Canada changed from 1945 into about the year 2000, and then we're going to get into talk a little bit about the history of Quebec and Canada relations, and also about First Nations as well. So lots of good stuff coming up. So thank you again. Have a great day.